Well, the first thing, of course, that happened, we lost 100 men in our regiment, killed or wounded. So that was the biggest shock of all. We knew something was going to happen, but we had no idea that many men would be killed or wounded. And then, of course, the next day it didn't make any difference. You just knew that somebody was killed, or Bill was killed, Jim was killed. You didn't pay much attention. It was just a common thing.
Much has been written about the Normandy landings, but little is known about the massacres that occurred on that same land. It involved the execution of around 156 Canadian soldiers, who were eliminated by a faction of the German forces that had taken them prisoner in June 1944, shortly after the beginning of the invasion on the beaches of northern France. The murders, which took place in various hideouts in the region, are one of the worst war crimes committed against the Canadian Army in modern history. What is most surprising is that all of this happened at the beginning of the fall of the Nazi regime, following the legendary D-Day operation. In this video, we will tell you about the identity of the perpetrators, their justifications for carrying out the massacre, and an incredible story of redemption. Don't move from your screens for this new installment of military history. Let's begin. On June 6, 1944, the Battle of Normandy began, with 3.5 million soldiers from both sides taking part, and it would continue until late August of that year. Allied troops landed on the northern French coast and then advanced inland, conducting a campaign to defeat the German forces opposing them. Later, they turned east, specifically towards Belgium, the Netherlands, and the German border. The official casualty figures from this military endeavor still send chills down the spine. It is estimated that around 625,000 people died, both among the Allies and the Germans, but it may be more. On Omaha Beach alone, which was the toughest stretch of the operation, 43,500 Americans and 12,000 Germans died. There was a unit that lost 90% of its men in the first wave. However, beyond the battles, there was a completely ruthless and inhumane massacre suffered by Canadian prisoners of war. The soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division of that country landed on Juno Beach and in the days and weeks that followed, fought a series of difficult battles in the countryside south of the region against a rather peculiar German regiment.
We were sent in as a sacrifice to try and stop the advance of the German 12th Panzer Division. When they really started to fire on us, of course we jumped off the tanks. Then they started to knock out tanks, a maximum of 5 minutes after we got off the tanks.
The Canadians overcame the beach defenses on the first day of the invasion through collective effort, but at a high cost in human lives. It was the morning after when the Canadians first encountered the division that would become their main nemesis in Normandy, the 12th SS Panzer Division. This regiment was composed of members of the Hitler Youth between the ages of 17 and 19, and officers forged in the fire of the 1st SS Panzer Division, an elite formation of the Waffen-SS initially formed as Adolf Hitler's personal armed guard. The combination of fanatic Nazi teenagers and non-commissioned officers who had fiercely fought against Hitler's detractors led to the division's propensity to brutally and bloodily murder prisoners of war. This battalion committed some of the first atrocities against Canadian prisoners of war. The justification was that the SS soldiers were furious about the number of casualties they had suffered and wanted blood to avenge the fallen, as they believed these losses were inflicted by soldiers they considered inferior. When they took the village of Authie, the Nazis were so blinded by hate and violence that they directly beat and bayonet the first Allied soldiers they captured without any justification. On June 7, 1944, dozens of Canadians from the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Canadian 27th Armoured Regiment were taken prisoner after intense fighting in the village of Authie. The Germans took their captives to the nearby Abbaye d'Ardennes, the Abbey of Ardennes, an ancient stone church where Colonel Meyer had established his headquarters after D-Day. Later that same night, 11 Canadian prisoners of war were escorted to the garden of the place. After being interrogated and humiliated, they were shot without the slightest consideration. The following morning, 7 more prisoners of war, all from the northern mountains of Nova Scotia, were taken outside the Abbey's facilities and met the same fate. Each man was shot in the back of the head at point-blank range. Most of these Canadian deaths occurred within the first 10 days of the Allied invasion of France. The nature of these crimes ranged from spontaneous individual killings of captives to premeditated mass executions. Colonel Kurt Meyer, commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division, was the only perpetrator charged for his role in the atrocities. Beyond the horror and cruelty, these executions were not only morally condemnable but also legally reprehensible. The actions of the German regiment violated the Geneva Conventions, which strictly prohibited the execution of prisoners of war and instead stipulated that they should be treated humanely for future negotiations during or at the end of the conflict. Despite knowing they were violating the rules of warfare and the codes of honor, this bloodthirsty Nazi battalion continued with their terrifying and disgusting practices.
All of a sudden, I heard a shot close, and I turned around and Lou had been shot in the head. There was a German standing right behind me. And then they took us to a German headquarters. There's a major there. And he could speak English quite well. And he says, "I don't know why you were taken prisoner." I'll tell you what, I was so scared. And then all of a sudden, I just thought, I won't even hear the gun go off. It'll be over fast.
On June 8, 64 Canadians, including several dozen members of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles Battalion, were captured during combat near the village of Poudou-en-Bessin. The captives were taken to the Château d'Audru, a property requisitioned by officers of the 12th SS. Later that day, following the same modus operandi as at the Abbaye d'Ardenne, 45 of the Canadians were coldly executed. First, they were taken in batches to the castle grounds, where they were interrogated and tortured before being shot in the back of the head. There were Canadian soldiers who were allowed to escape, and others managed to flee, but the Nazis did this merely for their own amusement. Before midnight, all had been captured and would be annihilated in the same manner, only to be buried in mass graves that would not be found until the end of the war. In addition to these highlighted events, there were other examples of similar massacres in brutality and lethality. After the Battle of Bretonville on June 7, 1944, and after a tank skirmish near the village of Loumesnil-Patry 4 days later, dozens of Canadian prisoners of war were taken and disposed of like trash by the Nazis. However, we wanted to end the video with another story, as chilling and bloody as the others but with a slightly brighter ending. The name Heinrich Severloh may not mean anything to you, but he was a young German infantryman who participated in the Normandy landings on the side of the Nazis. At 6 o'clock in the morning on that fateful day, an officer woke him up to deliver news that no soldier of the Wehrmacht wanted to hear: the Allied invasion had begun. He immediately moved to his post, the Resistance Nest 62, located at the point now known as Easy Red, the last stronghold of the German troops that would fall that day, where hundreds of young men would lose their lives. He took up a combat position immediately, grabbing his assigned weapon, a general-purpose MG-42 machine gun with a tripod. He also placed a Mauser Kar 98K rifle by his side, just in case. As he watched the Allied threat advance, he knew he would have to be prepared for anything to survive. Severloh fired from 6 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon that day. According to official data, he discharged approximately 13,000 rounds, but he would forever remember the first one he fired that day. That shot hit a young American who had just reached the shore. The German soldiers sought his prey perfectly as the American sought shelter from enemy fire among the obstacles on the beach. He aimed for the chest, but due to his nerves and the weather conditions, he ended up hitting the head. Severloh watched as the helmet flew into the air, and the young man, about his own age, fell dead. Once the deed was done, and knowing that there was no turning back, he continued firing relentlessly, without thinking or feeling. It is said that he killed 1,000 Americans on Omaha Beach, although some dare to speak of twice as many victims. Heinrich Severloh was one of the main culprits responsible for the massacre of Allied soldiers that occurred on Omaha Beach. However, despite his efforts, the German troops were not more fortunate. Around him, comrades were constantly falling dead. In a contest where the only options were to kill or die, the soldier kept pulling the trigger. Everything around him was noise, fire, blood, explosions, and horror. When the machine gun ammunition ran out, he didn't hesitate and grabbed his rifle. By then, only he and a superior were defending the position, as the defense line had collapsed around them. An officer, the only survivor, told him they had to retreat because they had lost the battle. During that retreat, he was captured and seriously wounded, but he was not killed. He became a prisoner of war in a series of prisons under such miserable conditions that they left him with physical scars. He would not comment on what happened that day until much later when he confessed what he had done. Fate provided him with the opportunity to reconcile with one of the Americans who landed there, a soldier who became a priest and was wounded 3 times on D-Day, most likely by Severloh. The two returned to Omaha and were able to embrace, achieving an inner peace that none of the executed Canadian soldiers or the Germans of the 12th SS Panzer Division could ever reach.
When I go back over there and go in these cemeteries and read a lot of the names of people that I knew, a lot of them, and I say to myself, was it really necessary? Why couldn't people just be able to talk some sense into one another?
We are now approaching the end of this video, and we wanted to ask you, what do you think of the Germans' behavior towards Canadian prisoners of war? Leave your opinions in the comments below. That's it for today's video. We thank you for watching until the end and look forward to seeing you in the upcoming installments of Military History.